It was around the year 960. The place was a farm called Borg on the west coast of Iceland. The man was Egil Skallagrímsson. He was an old man now. He had been a poet and a warrior his whole life. He had fought for kings and killed many men. He had a temper that was famous across the North Atlantic. But now he was broken. His favorite son, Bodvar, had drowned. A storm had taken his boat in the fjord nearby. Egil had gone to the shore himself. He found his son's body and carried it to a burial mound he had built for his own father. He buried the boy there. Then he went back to his longhouse. He went to his bed closet, a small private room walled off from the main hall. He lay down on the bed. He pulled the door shut, and he refused to eat or drink. This was not just grief. The sagas have a word for it. They called it hugsat. It means mind sickness. It was a deep depression, a consuming sorrow that drained the will to live. Egil, the great skald, the feared Viking, had decided to starve himself to death. His wife Asgerd was frantic. She sent messengers to their children who lived at other farms. Their daughter Thorgerd arrived. She was a clever woman. She went to Egil's bed closet and spoke loudly. She said she too had no wish to live without her brother. She said she would also refuse all food. She lay down on another bed inside the small room. Egil heard this. He seemed to approve. Time passed. Later, Thorgerd called out to him. "Father," she said, "we are chewing something. It is called dulse. It is a seaweed. They say it makes you thirsty." He asked for some. She gave it to him. It was salty, as dulse is. After a while, he said he was very thirsty. Thorgerd called for a drink. She brought him a horn. She said it was water. Egil was weak. He took the horn and drank a huge gulp. But it wasn't water, it was milk. As soon as he swallowed, he knew he'd been tricked. He bit a piece out of the drinking horn. He was angry. He said she had deceived him. Now that he had drunk milk, his plan to starve was broken. He could not just start again. It would be undignified. Thorgerd sat with him. She did not leave. She began to talk to him. She did not tell him to get over his grief. She did not tell him to be strong. She told him to do the one thing he was better at than anyone else. She told him to write a poem for his son. It would be a monument, more lasting than a stone. She said if he did not, his son's memory would not be properly honored. She said she would stay with him until he tried. The idea took hold. It gave him a purpose. The grief was still there. The pain was immense. But now it had a shape. It had a direction. He began to compose the lines in his head. This poem would be called Sonatoric, The Loss of Sons, and it would save his life. Number 15, they built things that lasted. His name was Ingimund the Old. He was born in Norway around the year 850. He was a powerful chieftain in the district of Romsdal. He had friends in high places. He was a close friend of King Harald Fairhair, the man who was trying to unite all of Norway under his rule. Ingimund was a successful man. He had a large farm, a loyal following, and a good reputation. But his world was built on shifting ground. The king's ambitions were causing conflict. Old loyalties were breaking. Men were being forced to choose sides. One winter, Ingimund held a great feast. He invited a woman who was known to be a seeress, a vulva. Her name was Hordis, and she was from the north, one of the Sami people who had a reputation for seeing things others could not. During the feast, Ingimund and his friends asked her about their futures. She told them many things. When it was Ingimund's turn, she told him something he did not expect. She said his future was not in Norway. She told him he would settle in a new land, a land he had never seen, Iceland. She described a specific valley to him. She said his high seat pillars, the sacred posts of his hall, would show him the way. Ingimund laughed. He said he had no intention of leaving his home. He was happy in Norway. Iceland was a new, wild place. People were going there to escape the king, to find, new land. But, he was the king's friend. Why would he leave? He dismissed the prophecy, but things changed. The political situation in Norway grew more tense. There was a battle. Ingimund fought for the king. He was victorious, but the victory felt hollow. The world he knew was disappearing. The prophecy began to weigh on him. One day, some of his possessions went missing. Among them was a small silver figurine of the god Freyr that he treasured. And he was troubled. He sent some of his men to Sami magicians to find the lost items. They went into a trance. When they came out of it, they told him the same thing the seeress had. They said the silver Freyr was not in Norway. It was in Iceland. It was waiting for him at the bottom of a pouch, buried in the ground in a specific valley. They described the exact same valley Hordis had. This was too much to be a coincidence. Ingimund felt a shift in his mind. The uncertainty of his life in Norway suddenly felt heavier than the uncertainty of a new life in Iceland. The prophecy was no longer a strange prediction. It was a path. It gave him a sense of destiny, a purpose that cut through the political chaos. So he made a decision. He would leave. He was not a young man. He was called Ingimund the Old for a reason. But he gathered his family, his household, his followers. He loaded 2 large ships. He brought his livestock, his tools, his weapons. He brought his high seat pillars. These were more than just wood. They were carved with images of the gods. They represented the heart of his home, the continuity of his family. They sailed west. When they sighted the coast of Iceland, Ingimund did as the tradition dictated. He threw his high seat pillars overboard. He believed the gods would guide them to the place where he was fated to settle. He landed his ships on the north coast of the island. Then the real work began. They spent 3 years searching. They moved along the coast, looking for the pillars. This was not a quick or easy task. It was a long, arduous process of exploration and survival in a new, harsh landscape. The search itself was a form of therapy. It required constant focus, it demanded physical effort, it left little room for doubt or regret about the life he had left behind. Finally, they found them. The pillars had washed ashore at the mouth of a long, beautiful fjord. They followed the fjord inland, and it opened into a wide valley. It was exactly as the seeress had described it. They named the place Vatnsdalur, the Valley of the Lakes. And here, Ingimund began to build. This was not just about survival, it was about creating order out of wilderness. He chose a spot for his farm, Hof, which means temple. He and his people felled trees. They cut turf from the ground, thick bricks of earth and grass. They laid a foundation of stones. They raised the long, curved walls of a great longhouse. Inside, they dug a long fire pit down the center of the floor. They built raised platforms on either side for sleeping and sitting. They placed the high seat pillars in their place of honor. This act of building was a powerful remedy for the trauma of displacement. Every stone laid, every beam raised, was a declaration of permanence. He was not just building a shelter, he was building a new world. He was taking the chaos of his uprooted life and giving it a solid physical form. The work was hard. The Icelandic winters were long and dark, but the daily rhythm of construction, of farming, of establishing a new community was grounding. It connected him and his people to the land in a profound way. When the longhouse was finished, it was more than a building. It was a symbol of his successful transition. He had taken a prophecy, a piece of mental guidance, and made it real. He had dealt with the psychological stress of leaving his ancestral home, not by looking back, but by building something new to look forward to. He created a legacy. The Vatsdala saga tells his story, and archaeological work in places like Vatnsdalur confirms the type of structures he would have built. The very foundations of these longhouses, dug into the Icelandic soil, are a testament to this method of coping. They took their anxieties and their uncertainties and they built a home. Number 14, they believed fate was inescapable. The man was named Gisli Sursson. He was an Icelander living in the late 10th century. His story is told in the Gisla saga. It is a dark story full of conflict and loss. It begins with a blood brotherhood ceremony that goes wrong. A web of jealousy and betrayal is spun, and it leads to the killing of Gisli's brother-in-law, a man named Thorgrim. And Gisli is the one who does the killing, avenging an insult to his family. But this act sets his life on a new course. He is declared an outlaw. In Viking Age Iceland, being an outlaw was a death sentence. It meant any man could kill you without penalty. It meant you had no legal protection. You could not live on your farm, trade at the market, or seek help from your neighbors. You had to flee. You had to hide. For 13 years, Gisli lived as an outlaw in the remote fjords of western Iceland. This life was a constant source of psychological torment. He was always on the run. He could never rest. He had to rely on the secret help of his wife, Odd, and a few loyal friends. The stress was immense, and it began to manifest in his dreams. The saga tells us that Gisli was haunted by two dream women. They would come to him in his sleep. One was good and one was evil. The good dream woman was beautiful and kind. She rode a white horse. She would offer him comfort. She would tell him to abandon the old gods and embrace the new Christian faith, which was just beginning to reach Iceland. She promised him peace after his death if he lived a good life. Her presence was a balm, a small island of tranquility in his troubled mind. The other dream woman was terrifying. She was dark and menacing. She rode a gray horse. She would wash him in blood and gore. She would show him visions of his own death. She told him he had only a few years left to live. Her visits left him shaken, covered in sweat, and filled with dread. These dreams were not just random nightmares. For Gisli, and for the people of his time, they were prophetic. And they were a window into his orlog, his personal fate. The concept of fate was central to the Norse worldview. It was not a simple idea of predestination. It was more like a thread woven into a great tapestry by the Norns, three mythical women who controlled the destinies of gods and men. Your thread had a certain length. It had a certain color. You had the freedom to move along that thread, to make choices, to fight, to be brave, or to be a coward. But you could not change the thread itself. You could not make it longer. Gisli's dreams were telling him that his thread was running out. The evil dream woman was showing him the bloody end that was woven for him. He could have despaired. He could have given up, but he did not. He accepted it. This acceptance of fate was a powerful psychological tool. It did not remove the fear or the pain, but it removed the anxiety of the unknown. Gisli knew he was going to die. He knew it would be violent. The question was no longer if he would die, but how he would live the time he had left. Instead of being paralyzed by fear, he was freed by certainty. He focused on what he could control, his own actions, his own honor. He continued to evade his enemies with cleverness and courage. He remained loyal to his wife. He protected those who helped him. He faced his situation head-on. The belief in an inescapable fate allowed him to compartmentalize his dread. The outcome was already decided. All that mattered was the journey to that outcome. This mindset transformed his suffering from a meaningless persecution into a test of his character. It was his personal saga, and he had to play his part well. In his final years, the evil dream woman's visits became more frequent, more terrifying. The good dream woman offered him only the promise of peace after death. He knew his time was short. His enemies, led by his own brother-in-law, were closing in. They finally cornered him at his hiding place, a remote cliff by a river. He was outnumbered perhaps 15-1. He could have tried to surrender. He could have begged for his life, but that was not his path. His fate was to die fighting. And so he did. The saga describes his last stand in vivid detail. He fought with incredible ferocity. He killed several of his attackers. He was wounded many times. Even when he was near death, he fought on, using his own entrails to hold himself up. He died on his feet, a warrior to the end. Gisli Sursson's story is tragic, but from a psychological perspective, his belief in fate gave him a framework to endure 13 years of unimaginable stress. It provided a narrative for his suffering. It allowed him to find meaning in his struggle and to face his death with a courage that became legendary. It was a way of dealing with trauma by accepting the worst possible outcome and then focusing all one's energy on living honorably until that outcome arrived. Number 13, they found solace in the natural world. Rafna Floki Vilgerdarsson lived in Norway in the second half of the 9th century. This was a time of great change. King Harald Fairhair was consolidating his power, and many were looking for a way out, for a new place to live, free from his rule. A new land had been discovered in the west. A Norwegian sailor named Naddod had been blown off course and found it. Another, a Swede named Gardar Svavarsson, had circumnavigated it and confirmed it was an island. They called it Snowland, or Gardar's home. Floki heard these stories. He was intrigued. He decided he would go and see this land for himself. He was not a typical Viking raider. He was an explorer. He was looking for a home. He prepared his ship, gathered his family and his men. And he did something unusual. He took 3 ravens with him. The journey was long and difficult. They sailed first to the Shetland Islands, then to the Faroe Islands. In the Faroes, he released the first raven. It flew up, circled, and then headed straight back east towards Norway. Floki knew they were still closer to the world they had left behind. They sailed on. After some time, he released the second raven. This one flew into the air, circled for a while, and then landed back on the ship. This told Floki that there was no land in sight. They continued west into the vast, empty ocean. The psychological toll of such a journey would have been immense. The endless water, the feeling of being untethered from the known world, the anxiety of not knowing what lay ahead. Finally, Floki released the third raven. It flew high into the air, it circled once, and then it flew purposefully to the west. Floki ordered his men to follow it. The raven was his guide, his connection to the natural world that he trusted to lead him. It was his compass. The raven led them to land. They had reached the eastern coast of the new island. They sailed west along the south coast and then up into a large fjord in the west. The fjord was teeming with life. The sagas say the waters were so full of fish that they spent all their time fishing. They caught so much that they neglected the other essential task of a northern farmer making hay. They were surrounded by the raw, powerful beauty of the Icelandic landscape. The steep mountains, the green shores, the cold, clear water. The long summer days where the sun barely set, for a time it must have felt like a paradise. This deep connection to the natural world, the reliance on its signs like the flight of a raven, the joy in its bounty, was a source of great comfort and purpose. It was a direct, tactile relationship with the earth. But the natural world in the north is not just a gentle provider. It is also a harsh master. The summer passed, the days grew shorter, and then the winter came. It was a brutal, relentless winter. All of their livestock, the animals they had brought with them from Norway, perished from lack of fodder. They had been so mesmerized by the abundance of the summer that they had forgotten the reality of the winter. The experience was crushing. The paradise had turned into a prison of ice and snow. The psychological blow must have been devastating. Their hopes for a new life were frozen. They were defeated by the very nature they had initially celebrated. Floki, in his despair and bitterness, climbed a mountain. From the top, he looked out and saw a fjord full of drifting ice. In that moment, he gave the country its name. He called it Iceland. They survived the winter barely. When spring came, they prepared to leave. Floki was disillusioned. His grand venture had failed. He returned to Norway with a bleak report. He told everyone that Iceland was a worthless land, a place of nothing but ice. He was a man traumatized by his encounter with the untamed North. But not everyone in his crew agreed. One of his men, named Thorolf, had a different perspective. He had also experienced the harsh winter. But he had not lost his appreciation for the land's richness. He believed they had simply made a mistake. They had been unprepared. He saw the potential. He told people back in Norway that the land was so rich that butter dripped from every blade of grass. This story shows two different psychological responses to the same natural environment. For Floki, the harshness of the winter overshadowed everything else. It was a trauma that soured his view of the entire experience. But for Thorolf, the memory of the abundant summer, the green pastures, the fish-filled fjords, was strong enough to outweigh the hardship. He understood that the challenge of nature was part of its character. Floki's story is a reminder that the Viking relationship with nature was not a simple romantic one. It was a source of both profound solace and profound stress. They dealt with it by observing it closely, by learning its rhythms, by respecting its power. The flight of the raven, the changing of the seasons, the feel of the soil, these were the things that grounded them. Even in his failure, Floki's method was to engage directly with the world around him. He climbed a mountain to understand his situation. His response, naming the entire island out of a moment of despair, was his way of processing his experience, of giving it a form and a name. He tried to contain the trauma by labeling its source, and eventually, despite his initial report, he did return to Iceland and lived out his days there. The land had called to him, and even its harshness could not ultimately drive him away. Number 12, they formalized their grief. In the year 834, a woman of great importance died in Vestfold, Norway. We do not know her name. We do not know if she was a queen, a priestess, or a wealthy matriarch. But we know she was powerful. The way her community dealt with her death tells us a great deal about how they processed collective grief. Her death was not a private sorrow. It became a monumental public project. The process began with the selection of a ship. It was a beautiful vessel, a Carvey-style longship, almost 22 meters long. It was not a new warship. It was an old, elegant vessel, already decades old when it was chosen. It was made of oak with intricate carvings of gripping beasts and swirling patterns covering its prow and stern. And this ship, a symbol of travel, power, and connection to the sea, was to be her coffin. It would not be sent out to sea and burned, as is often imagined. It would be buried in the earth. The ship was dragged ashore and moved to a prepared site near the sea. A burial chamber was built on the deck, just behind the mast. Inside, the woman was laid to rest. She was not young. Her analysis of her skeletal remains suggests she was between 60 and 70 years old. She suffered from advanced arthritis and other ailments. She may have been in chronic pain for much of her later life. She was dressed in fine red wool, with delicate silk accents imported from the east. She was not buried alone. Another woman was laid to rest with her. This second woman was younger, perhaps in her early 50s. Her remains suggest a healthier life, but a broken collarbone, possibly from a heavy blow, hints at a complex story. We do not know if she was a servant, a relative, or a companion who chose to follow her mistress into the afterlife. Then the community began to fill the ship with gifts. This was the heart of the grieving process. It was a way for people to express their love, their respect, and their sorrow through tangible objects. The sheer quantity and quality of the items are staggering. Like, they placed a fully decorated wooden cart, its panels carved with scenes from Norse myths. They included 3 ornate sleighs and 1 working sleigh. They put in beds with carved animal headposts, chairs, chests, and kitchen utensils. There were looms for weaving, buckets for milk, and tools for farming. They included 15 horses, 4 dogs, and 2 oxen, all sacrificed to accompany the women. This act of giving was a collective therapy. Each object represented a part of the deceased woman's life. The weaving tools spoke of her role in the household. The sleighs and carts spoke of her status and her journeys. The animals were her companions. By placing these things in the grave, the community was acknowledging every facet of her existence. They were telling the story of her life, one object at a time. It was a way of saying goodbye that was active, not passive. It required participation, it required effort. Once the ship was filled, the final stage began. They started to build the mound. This was not a small task. The Osberg Mound, as it is now called, is over 40 meters long and more than 6 meters high. So it is made of thousands of tons of turf, stone, and clay. This would have required a massive, coordinated effort from the entire community. For weeks, perhaps months, people would have worked together, cutting the turf, hauling the stones, and carefully layering them over the ship. This physical labor was itself a form of grieving. The repetitive, strenuous work would have channeled their sorrow into productive action. As they worked, they would have talked. They would have shared stories about the woman they were burying. They would have reinforced their community bonds. The construction of the mound was a public performance of grief, a shared experience that brought everyone together. It transformed their individual pain into a collective monument. When the mound was finally sealed, it stood as a permanent landmark. It dominated the landscape. It was a constant presence, a physical manifestation of their loss and their respect. It did not hide death away. It gave it a place of honor in the world of the living. Every time someone saw the mound, they would remember the woman buried within it. But they would also remember the great effort their community made to honor her. The Oseberg burial shows us that the Vikings dealt with profound loss not by quiet contemplation alone, but by loud, laborious, and communal action. They took their grief, which is an abstract and internal emotion, and they turned it into something solid, tangible, and enduring. They built a mountain for a matriarch. They did not just mourn her, they celebrated her life by surrounding her with its evidence. The process was a ritual that guided the entire community through the stages of grief, from the initial shock of death to the final acceptance of loss, leaving behind a powerful symbol of love and memory that would last for more than 1,000 years. Number 11, they used dark humor to endure the dark. The battle was raging. It was the Battle of Svolder in the year 1000. It was a sea battle, a chaotic mess of ships locked together, men fighting hand-to-hand on crowded decks. On one side was Olaf Tryggvason, the King of Norway. On the other was a coalition of his enemies, the King of Denmark, the King of Sweden, and a Norwegian jarl named Erik Håkonarson. King Olaf's ship, the legendary Long Serpent, was the largest and most powerful warship in the north. It was being swarmed by enemy vessels. The fighting was desperate. One of the king's best warriors was a man named Einar Thambarskelfir. He was an archer, said to be the best in all of Norway. He stood on the deck of the Long Serpent, firing arrow after arrow at the enemy. He was aiming for Jarl Erik, the leader of the Norwegian forces fighting against their king. Einar drew his great bow. He loosed an arrow. It flew across the space between the ships and struck the tiller of Jarl Erik's ship right above the Jarl's head. It buried itself deep in the wood. The Jarl looked up at the quivering arrow. He turned to his own archer, a man named Finn. "Shoot that tall man by the mast," he said calmly. Finn shot an arrow. It hit the middle of Einar's bow just as he was drawing it for another shot. The bowstring snapped, the great bow broke in two with a sound like a thunderclap. King Olaf, who was fighting nearby, heard the noise. He called out, "How was that broke with such a loud bang?" Einar Thambarskelfir looked at the two pieces of his shattered bow in his hands. His greatest weapon was destroyed. He was effectively disarmed in the middle of a battle he was losing. It was a moment of disaster. His response was not a curse, nor a cry of despair. He shouted back to the king, "Norway, breaking from your hands, king." This was a stunning piece of gallows humor. In one short, sharp sentence, Einar managed to do several things. He acknowledged his personal failure. His bow was broken. He turned it into a powerful metaphor for the larger catastrophe unfolding around them. The king was losing his kingdom. And he did it with a cynical wit that was both grim and defiant. It was a way of looking directly at disaster and refusing to be broken by it. The ability to make a joke in such a moment is a sign of incredible psychological resilience. This type of humor, often called saga humor, is found throughout the Norse literature. It is dry, understated, and often very dark. It functions as a coping mechanism for people living in a world that was frequently brutal and unpredictable. Life was hard, winters were harsh, violence was common, death could come suddenly. A sense of humor that acknowledged the absurdity and difficulty of life was not a luxury, it was a necessary tool for survival. There is another famous story from the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. A warrior named Thorstein was fighting when an arrow struck him in the chest. He was leaning against a log, and he pulled the arrow out. He looked at it and saw there were bits of fat clinging to the arrowhead. He said, "The king has fed us well. I am still fat around the heart roots." Then he fell down and died. This is not the response of a man panicking in the face of death. It is the response of a man who is using his last breath to make a wry observation. He is facing his own end with a steady nerve, and a sharp wit. This kind of humor served a social purpose as well. In the chaos of a shield wall, a comment like that could raise the morale of the men around you. It showed that even in the face of death, a warrior's spirit was unyielding. It was a way of asserting control over a situation where, in reality, you had very little. You might not be able to stop the arrow, but you could control your reaction to it. This was not about being cheerful or optimistic. It was the opposite. It was a humor born of a deep-seated pessimism, an understanding that things would probably end badly. By making a joke about it, they were robbing the terrible situation of its power to terrify them. They were meeting the darkness with a wry smile, not a scream. It was a way of processing fear and stress in real time. It allowed them to continue functioning in circumstances that would otherwise be psychologically overwhelming. The laughter was not intended to banish the darkness, but to make it possible to stand and face it. Number 10, they sought justice, not just revenge. The story begins, as many in Iceland did, with a friendship. It was the late 10th century. The two men were named Gunnar Hamundarsson and Egil Thorgeirsson. Gunnar was a hero. He was tall, strong, and handsome, the greatest warrior in Iceland. He could fight with a sword in each hand. He could jump his own height in full armor. But he was also a peaceful man. He hated to kill. Egil was not a warrior. He was a man of law. He was wise, thoughtful, and respected by all for his knowledge of the complex legal codes that governed Icelandic society. He was so skilled at law that he could find a peaceful solution to almost any dispute. The two men were the best of friends. Their story, told in Njal's saga, is a long and tragic exploration of how a society tried to use law to contain the destructive cycle of feud and revenge. The Viking Age was a violent time. A killing, even an accidental one, could easily lead to a chain reaction of revenge killings that could destroy entire families. The psychological toll of living in a state of constant low-level warfare, always waiting for the next attack, was immense. The Icelandic Commonwealth, founded in 930, was a unique attempt to solve this problem. It had no king, no central government, no army. It had only the law. The law was everything. It was a complex system of rules and procedures that was memorized and recited by a law speaker at the annual assembly, the Althing. The Althing was a national gathering held every summer in a dramatic natural amphitheater of lava rock. It was part court, part parliament, part festival. It was the place where disputes were meant to be settled with words, not with weapons. Gunnar, despite being a man of peace, was constantly being drawn into conflicts by his proud and troublesome wife, Hallgerd, and by the insults of his enemies. For time and again, he was provoked into fights. He killed several men, but after each killing, instead of letting it escalate into a blood feud, he and Egil turned to the law. After one such fight, Gunnar went to the Althing to have his case heard. The family of the man he had killed was demanding vengeance. The case was brought before a local court. Egil acted as Gunnar's legal advisor. He did not argue that Gunnar was innocent. Gunnar had, after all, killed a man. Instead, he argued for a settlement. He proposed that Gunnar pay a large sum of money, called wergild, to the family of the deceased. This was a legally established system for compensating a family for their loss. The amount varied depending on the social status of the person who was killed. The negotiations were tense. The aggrieved family wanted blood, not money, but Egil was persuasive. He spoke of the need to maintain peace. He reminded everyone of the endless bloodshed that feuds could cause. He crafted a complex legal agreement that not only set the amount of compensation, but also included oaths of peace from both sides. The court approved the settlement, money was paid, hands were shaken, the crisis was averted. This process was a form of collective psychological healing. It took the raw, powerful emotions of grief and anger and channeled them into a structured, rational process. Instead of reaching for an axe, a man had to find witnesses, prepare a case, and argue it before his peers. The focus shifted from immediate violent retribution to long-term negotiated resolution. It gave people a sense of control. It offered a path to justice that did not involve more killing, but the system was not perfect. It relied on everyone agreeing to abide by the court's decision. And sometimes the pull of honor and the thirst for revenge were too strong. Gunnar's enemies eventually contrived a situation where he was outlawed for 3 years. The court decreed he had to leave Iceland. This was a legal exile designed to cool tensions, and Jarl begged him to go. He knew that if Gunnar stayed, he would be killed. Gunnar agreed. He packed his belongings and rode with his brother to the ship that would take him away. But as he rode past his farm, Hlíðarendi, his horse stumbled. He fell to the ground. He looked back at his home. He saw the green fields sloping down to the river, the hay crop shining in the sun. He said, "Fair is the hillside. It has never seemed so fair to me before. I am going to ride back home and not go away at all." It was a fatal decision, driven by a deep emotional attachment to his home. By defying the court sentence, he made himself fair game. His enemies gathered and besieged his longhouse. He fought them off single-handedly, but his bowstring broke. He asked his wife, Hallgerd, for a lock of her hair to repair it. She refused, reminding him of a time he had slapped her. This small act of domestic revenge sealed his fate. Without his bow, he was overwhelmed and killed. Gunnar's death triggered another round of the feud. His son and his friends sought revenge, and the cycle of killing continued. Even Engil, the man of law, was eventually trapped by it. His own sons became involved in a feud that led to a terrible climax. Their enemies surrounded Engil's farmhouse and set it on fire. Engil, his wife, and their grandson accepted their fate and lay down in their beds to die in the flames. The saga shows both the success and the failure of the legal system. For a long time it worked. It provided a vital mechanism for conflict resolution. It was a way for the community to deal with the trauma of violence by imposing a rational structure upon it. But it also shows that this structure was fragile. It could be broken by human emotions, by pride, by love of one's home, by the deep-seated desire for revenge. The law was a powerful tool for managing the collective psyche, but it was not a cure for the darkness in the human heart. Number 9. They listened to wise voices. The year was around 985. The man was Eric the Red. He was a powerful and hot-tempered chieftain. He had been born in Norway, but his father had been exiled for manslaughter, so the family had settled in Iceland. And Eric had inherited his father's temper. He became involved in a series of disputes in Iceland that ended with him killing several men. For this, he was sentenced to 3 years of outlawry by the Althing. He was banished from Iceland. Like his father before him, he had to find a new home. He had heard stories of a large land to the west, cited years earlier by a man named Gunnbjorn Ulfsson, who had been blown off course. Eric decided he would use his 3 years of exile to explore this land. He gathered a crew, prepared his ship, and sailed west. He found the land. He spent his 3 years of exile exploring its coasts. He found a fjord system on the southwestern coast with green pastures, a place where people could farm and raise livestock. He saw its potential. When his exile was over, he sailed back to Iceland. He had a plan. He wanted to lead a large-scale settlement of the new land. To attract people, he needed a good name for it. He called it Greenland. He reasoned that people would be more eager to go there if the land had an attractive name. His marketing worked. In the summer of 986, a fleet of 25 ships carrying men, women, children, and livestock set sail from Iceland for Greenland. It was a perilous journey. Only 14 of the ships made it. The others were either lost at sea or turned back. But the ones who arrived established 2 settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. Eric the Red, as the founder, became the paramount chieftain. Years passed, the settlement grew, but then a crisis arrived. A terrible famine struck the colony, the winters were harsh, the hunting failed, people were starving. The psychological stress on the small, isolated community must have been immense. They were far from any help. They were at the mercy of the climate. They performed their usual rituals to the Norse gods, but nothing changed. They were desperate. In the community lived a woman named Thorbjorg. She was known as the Little Volva, the Little Seeress. She was the last of 10 sisters, all of whom had the gift of prophecy. In times of great uncertainty and fear, people like Thorbjorg were immensely important. They were wise voices who could offer guidance, who could look beyond the present suffering and offer a glimpse of the future. She was a spiritual specialist, a kind of therapist for the community's soul. A leading farmer in the settlement, Thorkel, invited Thorbjorg to his farm to hold a ceremony. He wanted her to find out when the famine would end. The saga gives a detailed description of her arrival and the ritual. She wore a blue cloak adorned with stones. She had a string of glass beads around her neck and a hood lined with white catskin. She carried a staff with a brass-bound knob set with stones. Her belt was made of touchwood, and from it hung a large pouch containing the charms she needed for her magic. She wore calfskin shoes with long, strong laces and tin knobs on the ends. On her hands, she wore catskin gloves, white and furry on the inside. This detailed description is important. Her clothing and tools marked her as someone special, someone who stood outside the normal social order. They were the source of her authority. For the ceremony, a special high seat was prepared for her, with a cushion of hen's feathers. She needed a specific type of song to be sung, called Vardlokur, to help her enter a trance and communicate with the spirits. The problem was that the song was part of the old pagan magic, and the only person in the community who knew it was a young Christian woman named Gudrid. Gudrid was reluctant to participate in a heathen ritual, but Thorkel and Thorbjorg persuaded her. They argued that her help would benefit the entire community. It was her duty. Gudrid sang the song. The saga says her voice was so beautiful that many spirits were drawn to the farmhouse. They had been charmed by the song and were now willing to speak. Thorbjorg entered her trance. When she came out of it, she had good news. She told the community that the famine would end soon, the spring would be mild, and the fishing and hunting would improve. The sickness that had plagued them would also recede. The community was filled with relief. Thorbjorg's prophecy came true. The weather improved, the famine ended, the settlement survived. From a modern perspective, we might be skeptical of her powers. Perhaps she was just a keen observer of weather patterns. Perhaps it was a lucky guess, but that misses the point. Her role was primarily psychological. In a moment of extreme crisis, when the community was at its breaking point, she provided something essential: hope. She was a figure of authority, a wise voice they could trust. The elaborate ritual, the special clothing, the ancient songs, all of it created a powerful sense of occasion. It showed the community that their crisis was being taken seriously, that something profound was being done about it. By participating in the ritual, by listening to her words, they were able to shift their collective mindset from one of despair to one of hope. They were given a reason to keep going, to endure for just a little longer. People like Thorbjorg, the seeresses, the wise elders, the skilled law speakers played a crucial role in Viking society. They were the ones who people turned to in times of personal and collective trauma. They offered a framework of meaning. They provided guidance, they listened, and sometimes they simply told people that things were going to get better. And that belief in itself was a powerful medicine. Number 8, they shared their burdens in the mead hall. The longhouse stood in the center of the farmstead. At Borg, where Egil Skallagrímsson lived, or at Litterendi, Gunnar's home, it would have been the largest building by far. From the outside, it was a long, low structure with curved walls like an overturned boat. The walls were made of turf and stone, and the roof was covered in turf, so that in the summer it would have been green with grass. There were few, if any, windows. It was a dark, solid shelter against the harsh Icelandic wind, but inside it was a different world. The heart of the longhouse was the skalli, the main hall. Down the center of the long open room ran a fire pit, the Langaldar. This was the only source of light and heat. The smoke rose up to the timbered roof and found its way out through a hole in the ceiling. On either side of the fire pit were raised wooden platforms covered with furs and textiles. These were the benches where people sat, worked, and slept. The chieftain and his family had their place on one bench, their farmhands, servants, and guests sat on the other. This hall was the center of social and psychological life. It was where the community came together every single evening. And it was the site of the feast, the most important social ritual in Viking society. The feast was not just a party. It was a structured event that reaffirmed the bonds of the community. It was a way to deal with the stresses of life, a hard winter, a failed harvest, the return from a dangerous sea voyage, or the death of a community member. Consider the aftermath of a raid. A group of men returned home. Some might be wounded. Some might not have returned at all. They would all be carrying the psychological weight of the violence they had committed and witnessed. The feast was the mechanism for their reintegration into society. It would begin with a formal welcoming of the warriors. The chieftain would praise their courage. They would display the treasures they had won. This was a way of validating their experience, of giving it a positive spin. It framed the trauma of combat in the context of success and honor. Then, the drinking would start. They drank ale or mead from horns or wooden cups. Alcohol played a key role. It lowered inhibitions. It made it easier for men to speak of their experiences, to boast of their deeds, or to mourn their fallen comrades. The shared intoxication created a sense of emotional unity. Food was also central. Large joints of meat, mutton, beef, or horse would be roasted over the long fire. The smell of the cooking food, the warmth of the fire, the taste of the ale. These were powerful sensory experiences that grounded people in the present moment, in the safety and security of the hall. It was a stark contrast to the cold fear and uncertainty of the raid. The feast was also a time for storytelling. This was perhaps its most important psychological function. A skald, a professional poet, might be present. He would compose a poem on the spot, a drapa, praising the chieftain and the warriors. The poem would turn the chaotic, bloody reality of the raid into a heroic narrative. It would give their actions meaning and place them within the grand tradition of heroic deeds. It transformed individual trauma into a collective legend. But it was not just the professionals who told stories. The warriors themselves would speak. They would recount their experiences. They would joke. They would boast. They would lament. In the noisy, smoky, communal atmosphere of the hall, they could share their burdens. A man who was having nightmares about the face of someone he had killed could speak of it, perhaps not directly, but through a boast about his own ferocity. A man grieving for a friend could raise his horn and drink to his memory, and everyone else in the hall would drink with him. His private grief became a shared public ritual. The feast was a highly structured social therapy. The seating arrangement reinforced the social hierarchy, giving everyone a sense of their place in the world. The ritualized toasting and gift-giving strengthened the bonds between the chieftain and his followers. The storytelling provided a narrative framework for traumatic events. The shared consumption of food and drink created a powerful sense of belonging and solidarity. And archaeology confirms the importance of these halls. Excavations of Viking Age sites, like the one at Borg in the Lofoten Islands of Norway, have uncovered the remains of enormous longhouses, some over 80 meters long. They have found the post holes that held up the roof, the long fire pits, and the remains of the food and drink that was consumed there. These were the great theaters of Viking social life, the places where the psychological health of the community was maintained one feast at a time. They were a refuge from the cold, dark world outside, a place where people could come together in the firelight and remind each other that they were not alone. Number 7, they raised each other's children. Olaf was a peacock. That was his nickname, Olaf Peacock. He lived in the west of Iceland in the 10th century, and his story is a central part of the Laxdæla saga. He was known for his fine clothes, his handsome appearance, and his proud bearing. He was the son of a powerful chieftain, Hoskuld Dala Kolsson. But his mother, Melkorka, was a slave. Hoskuld had bought her at a market in Norway. She was beautiful, but she refused to speak, and everyone assumed she was mute. Only later did Hoskuld discover that she was actually an Irish princess who had been captured in a raid. Because of his mother's status, Olaf's position in the family was somewhat ambiguous. He was his father's son, but he was also the son of a slave. This created a certain psychological tension for him, a need to prove himself. As a young man, he decided to travel abroad to make his name and fortune. He went to Norway and then to Ireland, where he was acknowledged by his grandfather, the Irish king. He returned to Iceland a wealthy and respected man. He married a woman named Thorgerd, the daughter of the great poet and warrior Egil Skallagrímsson. They had a son, and they named him Kjartan. Kjartan grew up to be even more handsome and accomplished than his father. He was the golden boy of his generation. Olaf also had a foster brother, a man named Thord. The practice of fostering children was deeply ingrained in Viking society. A chieftain might send his son to be raised in the household of another chieftain. This was called foster. It was a way to create powerful bonds between families, stronger even than blood ties in some cases. The foster father was responsible for the child's education and upbringing. The child, in turn, owed his foster father loyalty for the rest of his life. This system had profound psychological benefits. It expanded a child's support network beyond their immediate family. It gave them a second set of parents, a second home. For the parents, fostering another's child was a great honor. It showed that they were trusted and respected. It also gave them an emotional connection to another family, creating a web of mutual obligation and support that was a crucial safety net in a dangerous world. When Thord's wife gave birth to a son, Thord came to his foster brother Olaf. He asked Olaf to foster the boy. This was a great gesture of respect, but Olaf was hesitant. He consulted his wife Thorgerd. She was strongly against it. She had a premonition, a dark feeling about the boy. She felt he would bring strife and sorrow to their family, but Olaf felt bound by his obligations to his foster brother. He could not refuse such a request without causing a grave insult. He agreed to take the boy. The boy's name was Boli, so Kjartan, the golden son, and Boli, the foster son, grew up together in Olaf's household at a farm called Hardarholt. As they were raised as brothers, they were inseparable, they loved each other deeply. The fosterage system had worked. It had created a powerful bond. This bond was a source of great strength and comfort for both young men. They trained together, hunted together, and shared all their secrets. But their brotherhood also contained the seeds of tragedy. As they grew into men, their love for each other came into conflict with their love for the same woman, Gudrun Osvifsdottir. This love triangle would ultimately lead to Kjartan's death at the hands of Bali. The foster brotherhood that was designed to create unity ended up being the cause of a terrible feud. Boli, torn between his love for his foster brother and the manipulations of Gudrun, made a fatal choice. But even in this tragic outcome, the power of the fosterage bond is clear. The saga tells us that after Boli and his men attacked Kjartan, Boli held his dying foster brother in his arms. Kjartan died with his head in Boli's lap. The act was not one of triumphant revenge. It was a moment of profound grief and regret. Boli had killed the man who was closer to him than anyone else in the world. The system of fostering was a social technology designed to build resilience and cohesion. It was a way of dealing with the inherent instability of the world by intentionally creating families of choice, not just of blood. It gave children a broader base of support, and it wove the elites of society together in a network of powerful emotional loyalties. It was a way of raising children to understand that their well-being was connected to the well-being of a community larger than their own immediate household. In the case of Kjartan and Boli, the system was tested to its breaking point by passion and jealousy. But the story's power comes from the fact that the bond was so strong to begin with. The tragedy is not that two enemies fought, but that two brothers did. The pain and psychological trauma that resulted from the killing were magnified 100-fold because of the love that the fosterage system had so successfully created. It was a powerful tool for social and emotional health, but like any powerful tool, it could also be part of a terrible destruction. And number 6, they believed action was a remedy. His name was Harold. He was the son of a minor king in Norway named Sigurd Syr. He was born around the year 1015. Through his mother, he was the half-brother of Olaf, who would later become King Olaf II of Norway and its patron saint. And Harald grew up in the shadow of his powerful older brother. In 1030, when Harold was just 15 years old, his brother Olaf returned to Norway from exile to try and reclaim his throne from the Danish king, Canute the Great. Harald insisted on joining him. He gathered a force of men from his father's lands and fought alongside Olaf at the Battle of Stiklestad. The battle was a disaster. Olaf's army was defeated and Olaf himself was killed. The 15-year-old Harold was badly wounded and had to be smuggled away from the battlefield in secret. This was a profoundly traumatic event for a young man. He had witnessed the death of his brother, the king. He had seen their cause utterly defeated. He was wounded, a fugitive in his own country. He could have been consumed by grief and despair. He could have hidden away, nursing his wounds and his loss. He did not. His response was immediate, relentless action. He fled Norway, crossing the mountains into Sweden. He did not stay there long. He gathered a group of loyal followers, men who had also survived Stiklestad. Together, they made their way south through the vast territory of the Kievan Ruses. They were exiles, mercenaries, men without a country. Their only asset was their skill as warriors. They eventually reached Constantinople, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire. This was the richest, most powerful city in the world. Harold and his men enlisted in the Varangian Guard. This was an elite mercenary unit in the service of the Byzantine Emperor, composed primarily of Norsemen. For the next decade, Harald lived a life of constant, violent action. He was no longer a defeated boy. He was a professional soldier. He fought for the emperor in Sicily, in Bulgaria, and in the Holy Land. He was a brilliant commander. He was ruthless, clever, and ambitious. He rose through the ranks of the Varangian Guard, becoming its commander. He amassed an enormous fortune. The sagas say he sent all his wealth back to the Kievan Russes for safekeeping with his future father-in-law, Prince Yaroslav the Wise. This period of his life was a form of therapy through motion. He did not have time to dwell on the trauma of his past. He was too busy surviving in the present and planning for the future. Every battle, every campaign, every political intrigue in the Byzantine court was a problem that required his full attention. The constant forward momentum of his life kept the ghosts of Stiklestad at bay. He was not just running from his past, he was actively building a new identity, a new source of power. He became known as Harald Hardrada, which means hard ruler or the stern. After about 10 years in Byzantium, he decided it was time to go home. He had the wealth, the military experience, and the reputation he needed. He left Constantinople, picked up his fortune in Kiev, and married Yaroslav's daughter, Elisif. Then he returned to Norway. He did not come back as a supplicant. He came back as a power to be reckoned with. He made an alliance with the King of Denmark and threatened to invade Norway. His nephew, who was now the King of Norway, was forced to make a deal. They agreed to rule as co-kings. A year later, his nephew died, and Harald Hardrada became the sole ruler of Norway. He had done it. The boy who had fled the battlefield at Stiklestad had returned 30 years later as king. He had transformed his trauma into fuel for his ambition. His method for dealing with loss and defeat was to throw himself into action, to constantly move forward, to never stop fighting. Even as king, he could not be still. He spent his reign in constant warfare, trying to reunite the old North Sea Empire of Knut the Great. He fought a long and draining war with Denmark, and then, in 1066, he saw his biggest opportunity. The King of England had died without an heir. Harald decided to claim the English throne. He assembled a massive invasion fleet, perhaps as many as 300 ships. He sailed to England and landed in the north. He won a major victory at the Battle of Fulford Gate. For a brief moment, it looked like he might succeed. But the English king, Harold Godwinson, force-marched his army north at incredible speed. He surprised the Norwegians at a place called Stamford Bridge. Harald Hardrada was caught unprepared. Many of his men did not even have their mail shirts on, but he was a warrior to the end. He led his men into battle. The saga says He fought like a berserker, striding ahead of his men, cutting down everyone in his path. But then an arrow struck him in the throat, and Harald Hardrada, the boy from Stiklestad, the commander of the Varangian Guard, the king of Norway, died on a battlefield in England. His life was a testament to the belief that action was a remedy for all ills. He dealt with grief, exile, and defeat by constantly seeking new challenges, new battles, new worlds to conquer. It was a philosophy that took him to the height of power, but it was also a philosophy that led him to his death. For Harald, the only way to live was to keep moving. The moment he stood still, he was vulnerable. Number 5, they relied on their kin. The year was 933. In Iceland, a man named Ketil was traveling with his son Thorvald and some farmhands. They were looking for their lost sheep. They came to the farm of a man named Thorkel. Thorkel's son, Hall, accused them of being sheep thieves. An argument broke out. It quickly turned into a fight. In the struggle, Hall was killed. This was the spark that ignited one of the great Icelandic feuds, described in the saga of the people of Uri. The death of a man was not just a personal tragedy, it was an assault on his entire family, his AET. The AET was the extended kin group, the clan. It was the fundamental unit of Icelandic society. It was your source of identity, your economic support, and your protection. An attack on one member was an attack on all. The honor of the kin group demanded a response. Hall's family was now faced with a choice. They could go to the Althing and seek legal compensation, or they could take direct revenge. The pressure to choose revenge was immense. It was a matter of honor. To accept money for a dead kinsman could be seen as a sign of weakness. The leader of Hall's kin group was a powerful chieftain named Arnkell Godi. A Godi was a combination of a priest and a chieftain. He was a local leader with both religious and political authority. Arnkell was a respected man known for being fair-minded, but he was also bound by the obligations of kinship. The news of the killing spread, the psychological pressure mounted on Arnkell and his family, their reputation was at stake. If they did not act, they would lose face in the community. Their grief was mixed with a powerful sense of social duty. They chose a middle path. They prosecuted the case at the local assembly. The killers were convicted and sentenced to lesser outlawry, meaning they were banished from the district for a time. This was a legal victory, but for some of Hall's kinsmen, it was not enough. The thirst for blood vengeance was strong. A few years later, a group of Arnkell's kinsmen, led by a man named Thorolf, ambushed and killed Thorvald, the son of the man who had started the trouble. Now, the other side had a grievance. The cycle had begun. This is where the strength and the danger of the kin group become clear. The family was a powerful support system. When you were in trouble, your cousins, your uncles, your brothers-in-law were obligated to help you. They would lend you money, give you a place to hide, and fight for you. This provided a huge sense of security. It was a buffer against the harsh realities of the world. If your farm burned down, your kin would help you rebuild. If someone wronged you, your kin would help you get justice. But this same system could also be a trap. It could force you into conflicts you did not want. Your personal feelings might be irrelevant. The honor of the family was paramount. This created a constant tension, a source of profound psychological stress. Arnkell, the chieftain, found himself caught in this trap. He was a man who seemed to prefer peace and order, but he was constantly being dragged into the feud by the actions of his more aggressive kinsmen. To support them, even when he may have disagreed with their actions, the feud escalated, more men were killed on both sides. The conflict drew in other families, connected by marriage and alliance. The entire district was becoming polarized. The stress of living in this environment, where any trip to the market or to a neighbor's farm could end in a deadly ambush, would have been corrosive. People had to be constantly vigilant. Trust was a rare commodity. The saga shows how the kin group could both cause and alleviate this stress. On the one hand, knowing that you had a dozen armed and angry cousins ready to back you up was a comfort. On the other hand, knowing that the foolish actions of one of those cousins could get you killed was a constant worry. The story of Arnkel ends tragically. He was eventually ambushed and killed by his enemies while he was out working on his farm. He was alone, which was a rare and fatal mistake. His death was a huge blow to his family and the entire district. He had been a force for stability even in the midst of the feud. The reliance on kin was the primary social and psychological support structure of the Viking Age. It gave people a sense of belonging and security that was essential for survival. It was the family that you turned to in times of grief, fear, or hardship. But it was a double-edged sword. The same bonds of loyalty that could save you could also doom you. The pressure to uphold the family honor, to avenge a slight, to join a fight you didn't believe in, was a powerful and often destructive force. The AET was both a fortress and a prison for the Viking mind. Number 4, they channeled pain into poetry. Egil Skallagrímsson sat in his sealed bed closet at Borg. He was in his 80s. He had lived a life of almost unbelievable violence and adventure. He had fought in great battles, served kings, and composed poetry that would be remembered for 1,000 years. But now, 2 great losses had broken him. First, his son Gunnar had died of a fever. Then, his favorite son Bodvar, a strong and promising young man, had drowned in a shipwreck just off the coast. The grief was a physical weight. It was the hug sought, the mind sickness that had settled on him. His decision to starve himself was not a moment of brief despair. It was a calm, settled intention. His life had lost its meaning. The pain was too great to bear. It was his daughter Thorgerd who found the way through his defenses. Her trick with the milk broke his fast, but it did not break his depression. It was her next suggestion that saved him. She did not tell him to forget or to be strong. She challenged him to remember. She told him to make a poem for Bodvar, an Urfadrapa, a funeral poem. She appealed to his identity not as a father, but as a skald, the greatest poet of his age. The idea worked. It gave his pain a purpose. He had to take the formless, crushing weight of his grief and force it into the incredibly strict and complex rules of skaldic poetry. This was not like writing a simple verse. Skaldic poetry was a technical marvel. It had a fixed number of syllables per line. It had a rigid pattern of alliteration, and it used a complex system of metaphors called kennings and heidi. A sword might be a wound serpent, the sea might be the whale road, a warrior might be a feeder of ravens. To compose a poem like this required immense intellectual effort. Egil had to find the right words, the right images, the right sounds, and he had to fit his raw emotion into a highly structured artificial form. This process was a kind of therapy. It forced him to step outside of his grief, to look at it, to analyze it, and to shape it. He was not just passively suffering, he was actively working with his pain. The poem he created is called Sanatorek, which means the difficult loss of sons. It is one of the most personal and powerful poems in all of Old Norse literature. It is not a stoic, heroic poem about accepting loss. It is a raw cry of pain, rage, and despair. He begins by saying that his tongue is heavy, that it is difficult for him to stir the steelyard of song. He rages against the god Odin, who was the god of both poetry and war. Egil felt betrayed. He had served Odin his whole life as a warrior, and Odin had given him the gift of poetry. But now, the same god had taken his sons. He says, "I was on good terms with the Lord of the Spear and trusted in him until the friend of the Chariot of Victory broke his friendship with me." He accuses the sea, personified as the sea god Aegir, of robbing him. "The sea has caused a great breach in the fence of my father's kin," he says. "The gap left by my son stands empty, and I see it cannot be filled. This is not the language of quiet acceptance." On railing against an unjust universe, he remembers his son Bodvar. He thinks about what he has lost, the future that has been stolen. He says if he could wield a sword against the sea god, he would fight him, but he knows he is a powerless old man. This feeling of helplessness is a core part of his grief. But then, as he works through the poem, something begins to shift. He acknowledges that Odin, the god who took his sons, also gave him a gift that cannot be taken away his skill as a poet. He says Odin gave him the faultless art, and this art is his consolation. It is the tool that allows him to fight back against his despair. He ends the poem not with happiness, but with a hard-won resignation. He says, "Now I am in a difficult position, yet I shall cheerfully and with a good will and without complaint await my death." The act of creating the Sonnetorek transformed Egil. It did not erase his grief. The pain was still there. But the poem had given it a shape. It had allowed him to express his rage, his sorrow, his love, his sense of betrayal. He had taken the chaos inside him and created something ordered and beautiful out of it. He had built a monument to his son made of words. When he had finished composing the poem, he recited it to his family. The saga says that after this, he got up from his bed. He took his place again as the head of the household. He lived for many more years. The poetry had been his medicine. It was a way of processing trauma that was active, creative, and deeply personal. It validated his feelings, even the dark and angry ones, and allowed him to find a way to continue living. Number 3, they confronted their fears, literally. Grettir Asmundarsson was born in Iceland around the year 1000. He was a difficult child. He was surly, ill-tempered, and lazy. But he possessed an incredible, almost supernatural strength. As he grew into a man, he became an outlaw, a troublemaker, and a hero, all at the same time. His story is told in Grettir's saga. In his youth, he worked as a shepherd at a farm in the north of Iceland. The place was haunted. Every winter, a shepherd would disappear, presumed killed by some monstrous creature. The man Grettir was working for, Thorbjorn, had a daughter named Thorun. Grettir was fond of her. When the current shepherd was found dead, his body broken and torn, Grettir agreed to take on the dangerous job of watching the sheep. He discovered that the killer was a troll woman, a monstrous giantess who lived in a cave behind a waterfall. Grettir, armed with a short sword, went to the cave. He fought the troll woman in a brutal, desperate struggle. He managed to cut off her arm, and she fell back into the chasm behind the waterfall, dead. He had saved the farm. He was a hero, but the story of his psychological trauma begins with a different monster. He traveled to Norway and found himself at a farm on an island. The farm belonged to a man named Thorfinn. The place was haunted by the ghost of a previous owner, a man named Glam. Glam had been a strange and unpopular shepherd. He had been killed on Christmas Eve by some unknown evil. After his death, he began to walk again. He was a draugr, an undead creature. He was a terrifying monster who haunted the farm, killing livestock and driving the servants mad with fear. No one dared to stay there. Grettir, who feared nothing, volunteered to deal with the ghost. He decided to spend the night alone in the main hall of the farmhouse. He lay down on a bench and pulled a fur cloak over him, waiting. In the middle of the night, he heard a huge noise. Glam was on the roof, trying to tear it open. Then the ghost came to the door. Grettir watched as Glam's enormous head peered into the hall. The saga says Glam was hugely tall, with a face that was pale as death and eyes that were wide and staring. Glam came into the hall. He saw the lump under the cloak where Grettir was hiding. He grabbed the cloak and pulled. Grettir held on. They began a terrible wrestling match. They crashed through the hall, breaking all the furniture. Glam was immensely strong, stronger than any living man. Grettir had to use all of his own legendary strength to fight him. He realized that if he grew tired, he would be killed. They struggled towards the outer door. In the fight, the doorframe was torn from the wall. And as they fell out of the house and into the moonlight, Grettir fell on his back with Glam on top of him. And then it happened. The moon was full and bright. The clouds parted for a moment, and Glam stared down at Grettir with his terrible, unblinking eyes. Grettir had faced down men and monsters. He had never known fear, but the sight of Glam's eyes in the moonlight terrified him. The saga says it was the only time in his life he was ever truly afraid. He was paralyzed by the sight. In that moment of paralysis, Glam spoke a curse. He said that from this night on, Grettir would have no more of his great strength. He said that Glam's eyes would always be before him. He would be afraid to be alone, and this fear would lead him to his death. The curse broke Grettir's paralysis. With a final desperate surge of strength, he managed to draw his short sword and cut off Glam's head. He then placed the head at the ghost's thigh, the traditional way to stop a Draugr from walking again. He had won, he had defeated the monster, but he had lost something vital. The curse had taken root in his mind. From that day forward, Grettir was a changed man. He was still strong, still a great warrior, but he was terrified of the dark. He could not bear to be alone after sunset. He would see Glam's eyes staring at him from every shadow. The saga says such a great horror was rooted in his mind from this that he saw all kinds of illusions, and ever after, both in daylight and at night, he would see those eyes of Glam's. This is a remarkably clear and powerful description of what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Grettir was suffering from intrusive images, Glam's eyes, hypervigilance, and a phobia, fear of the dark, directly related to his traumatic experience. The way Viking society dealt with this was, in many ways, that they didn't. They acknowledged it. They described it. They made it a central part of his character, but they had no cure for it. Grettir's trauma became his defining feature. His fear of the dark shaped the rest of his life. He had to have a companion with him at all times. He would often have a child sleep in his bed with him for comfort. His story shows that the Vikings understood that a terrifying experience could leave a permanent scar on the mind. They knew that a man's courage could be broken not by a sword, but by a look. They confronted their fears literally by fighting monsters in the dark. But the story of Grettir shows that even when you win the fight, the monster can stay with you forever. The confrontation itself was the source of a deeper, more lasting wound. His psychological injury was as real and as debilitating as any physical one, and it was this internal wound, not an external enemy, that ultimately fulfilled the curse and led to his downfall. Number 2, they understood the mind could be sick. Before Egil Skallagrímsson fell into his profound depression, the saga writers needed a word for it. They chose hugsat. This is a compound word. Hugur is a complex concept. It can mean thought, mind, spirit, heart, or courage. It was the seat of a person's personality and intellect. Sot means sickness, so hugsat is literally a sickness of the mind. The fact that this word existed tells us something crucial. They recognized that the mind, like the body, could become ill. This was not seen as a moral failing or a sign of weakness. It was a condition, a state of being. They had a whole vocabulary for different states of mental distress. When a warrior flew into a battle rage, seemingly immune to pain and fear, he might be described as berserksgangur, the gait of the bear shirt. This was a kind of frenzy, a temporary madness that gave him great power, but also made him a danger to everyone, friend and foe alike. After the frenzy passed, the saga says the warrior would be left weak and listless, a state they called umagnaðir, or unmighted. This suggests they understood that such an extreme mental state had a physical and emotional cost. There was also the word aidi, which could mean frenzy, madness, or rage. It was a loss of control, a state where reason was overwhelmed by passion. A person could be driven to AD by grief, by a magical curse, or by an insult to their honor. The story of King Magnus I of Norway, who ruled in the mid-11th century, provides an interesting case study. As a young king, he was known for his harshness and his fierce temper. He had spent years in exile after his father, Saint Olaf, was killed. When he finally gained the throne, he was merciless towards his father's enemies. His cruelty earned him the nickname Magnus the Bad. His skald, the poet Sævat Thordarson, was worried. He composed a poem called the Berzoglasvisur, the plain-speaking verses. And in this poem, he directly confronted the king. He did not flatter him, he criticized him, he warned him that his rage and his thirst for vengeance were alienating his people. He told him that a king should be just and merciful, not a tyrant. He essentially told the king that his mental state was a political problem. The poem had a profound effect on Magnus. He listened to the poet's words, he took them to heart. The saga says that he completely changed his behavior. He became a just and popular ruler. From that day on, he was known as Magnus the Good. This story shows that the Vikings saw a clear link between a leader's mental state and the health of the community. A king's rage was not just his own problem, it was a threat to the kingdom. And it shows that they believed this state could be treated, not with medicine, but with wise counsel, with words. The poet acted as the king's therapist, using a poem to guide him from a state of destructive anger to one of balance and reason. Another example comes from the laws. The old Icelandic law code, the Gragas, has provisions for what to do if a person goes mad, odur. If a man became insane and was a danger to himself or others, his family was legally obligated to restrain him. The law recognized that a person in such a state was not responsible for their actions. It was a medical condition, and the community had a duty of care. Consider the character of Skallagrim, Egil's father, from Egil's saga. Skallagrim was a great man, a warrior, and a blacksmith. But he had a dark side. He was subject to fits of rage that were very similar to the Berserkskanger. One evening, he was playing a ball game with his young son Egil. As the game went on, Skallagrim began to lose. His temper flared. He fell into a blind rage. He grabbed his son and was about to kill him. A servant woman who had been Egil's nursemaid as a child saw what was happening. She shouted at Skallagrim, "Are you turning your fury on your own son, Skallagrim?" He let go of Egil and turned on her instead, killing her in his rage. This episode is presented as a kind of sickness. It was a temporary madness that came over him, an inherited trait that he passed on to his son Egil. The family and the community understood this about him. They knew he was prone to these fits. It was part of who he was. They did not have a way to cure it, but they recognized it as a distinct and dangerous condition. By having a vocabulary for these conditions, Hugsot, Berserkskanger, IEDM, they were able to identify and talk about them. They understood that a person could be suffering from an illness that was not visible on the body. They saw that grief could break a person's will to live, that battle could leave a permanent shadow on the mind, and that rage could be a kind of temporary insanity. This understanding was the first and most crucial step in dealing with mental illness. They did not hide it or deny it. They gave it a name. Number 1, they knew a child's trick could save a man's life. Let us return to Borg, to the year 960. Egil Skallagrímsson is in his bed closet. He has been there for days. He is dying of a chosen starvation. The world has gone gray. The weight of his dead son is a stone on his chest. He is a great man, a famous man. He is a poet, a warrior, a chieftain. None of it matters. His power, his wealth, his reputation, these things are useless against the sickness in his mind. His wife has pleaded with him. His servants have tried to tempt him with food. His friends have offered words of comfort. Nothing has worked. He is locked inside his own grief, and he has thrown away the key. He has the strength and stubbornness to see his decision through to the end. And then his daughter arrives. Her name's Thorgerd. She is not a warrior. She is not a chieftain. She is a farmer's wife from a nearby valley. But she understands her father. She knows that a direct assault on his grief will fail. His pride is too great. His sorrow is too deep. He will not be reasoned with. So she does not try to reason with him. She joins him. She enters his dark space. She lies down on the bed next to his and declares that she too will starve. This is her first move, and it is brilliant. She is not telling him his grief is wrong. She is validating it. She is saying, your pain is so great, so justified, that I will share it. I will die with you. This act of profound empathy is what opens the first crack in his armor. He is no longer entirely alone in his decision. Her next move is the trick, the dulse, the salty seaweed. It seems like such a small thing. She offers it not as food, but as a shared activity, something to pass the time. "We are chewing on this," she says. "It is a simple human gesture," he accepts. "The salt does its work. It creates a physical need, a thirst, that momentarily distracts from the emotional pain. The body asserts its own demands." And then comes the final move. The horn of milk disguised as water. She does not ask him if he wants to live. She makes the decision for him. She uses his physical thirst to bypass his intellectual resolve. It is a deception, but it is a loving one. It is a trick born of desperation and deep understanding. She knows that if she can just get some nourishment into him, she can break the spell. The moment he drinks the milk is the turning point. His plan is ruined. But it is ruined by a trick, not by a defeat of his will. This allows him to save face. He can be angry at his daughter's cleverness, which is a much more active and life-affirming emotion than the passive despair he was drowning in. The anger is a spark. Thorgerd then uses that spark to light a fire. She does not leave him alone. She stays with him. And she gives him a new purpose: make a poem. She redirects his immense energy. For days, all his willpower had been focused on dying. She gives him a new, equally difficult task to create. She knows that for a man like Egil, a skald, the act of creation is the ultimate act of life. This entire intervention is a masterpiece of psychological first aid. Thorgerd uses no magic, no medicine, no religious rites. She uses empathy, cleverness, and a deep understanding of her father's character. This story, preserved for over 1,000 years, shows us the most fundamental way the Vikings dealt with mental trauma. They relied on each other. Specifically, they relied on the bonds of family. In the end, it was not the great warrior or the wise chieftain who saved Egil. It was his daughter. It was her intimate knowledge of his pride and his passion. It was her refusal to let him go. The story tells us that they understood that the deepest wounds are not healed by grand gestures, but by small, clever human ones. They knew that sometimes the only way to lead someone out of the darkness is to go in there with them, to sit with them, and to trick them into taking a single sip of life. They knew a child's trick could save a man's life.